Okay, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session. I am Narasimha Rao. I am the Associate Professor of Energy Systems here at the Yale School of the Environment. And it really is a profound pleasure for me to moderate this panel today. We have assembled a really interesting group of panelists who've taken a lot of trouble to take part today, some of them traveling from really far, and even those who are virtual, really making a lot of effort to accommodate this. So I'm really very grateful for that. This panel is about field perspectives on energy transitions in the Global South. I wanted to set up a little bit the panel with some framing remarks, talk about the justice issues more broadly. Then I'm going to introduce the panelists very briefly. You have more extensive bios on the webpage. And then I'm going to ask each of them to speak for not more than 15 minutes, 12 to 13 minutes, hopefully. Then I will prompt them with some questions and have a conversation, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for some questions. So, we are probably heading towards exceeding temperatures above some of the most ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. That seems to be unfortunately where we're heading, but that doesn't change the urgency for the need to reduce our global emissions to zero as soon as is really possible. And I say global emissions and not just net zero, because we tend to rely too much on the sequestration and offsets rather than thinking about how we can actually reduce emissions. So we have this urgency. And we also know now, it's a pretty well established in report after report of the IPCC, that the poor parts of the world, poor communities in rich countries are going to disproportionately face the effects of climate. And that can raise a number of claims for justice. So I want to lay out how we might think about this. So first of all, we are interested in a fair allocation of the costs to avoid future climate change as much as we can. And so that concerns more conventionally what we think of equity in mitigation. But we also need to think about allocation of resources for adapting to climate change that we expect to see. So that's climate adaptation. But there's also climate impacts that we're already facing. If we just think about Pakistan today, where you have more than 1/3 of the country that has been underwater, and those sorts of events we know their intensity and frequency are exacerbated by climate change. So the topic of loss and damages for existing climate impacts that are clear and present also are really important. But let's also understand the conventional view of just transitions we talk about, which is more of the process of energy transformation and thinking about the justice outcomes in that process. And for example, avoiding adverse distributional impacts, thinking of jobs and retrenchment and moving from one industry to another. So a lot of procedural issues also around just transformations, we might say. And then we also have to understand in the Global South that we're dealing with regions of the world where they're already having an energy transition of one kind on which we're imposing a climate-driven energy transition. That is, we have 2.5 billion people today who still cook with solid fuels, who are seeking, many of them are seeking modern, clean forms of energy. We have 700 billion people who lack electricity access, 700 million people who lack electricity access, and several hundred million more who have very poor conditions of electricity access. And this affects their ability to secure other services in life. So we're thinking about, in some sense, the threats to achieving these goals of rising out of poverty from mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change. But it may also offer opportunities for people potentially to leapfrog, as they say, using clean energy with new technologies to try and actually fill gaps in some of these services. So those are, in some sense, the broad justice issues. We in this panel want to focus on electrification. There's of course, many issues we may focus on, but we're thinking about grids. We need to electrify grids to a large extent. We need to extend grids to people. We need to connect them to renewable forms of energy as well, low carbon forms of energy. And so there are many issues that arise in that process, and we want to think through all the justice implications of those kinds of transformations. So that brings me to my esteemed panel. So we have Professor Sonia Klinsky, who's an associate professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. She's joining us from India. And as the only academic on the panel, let's not mistake that she's actually also very involved in practice in policy. So she actually is going to be involved in the upcoming COP in Egypt as a facilitator in some of the negotiations around equity. We have Mahua Acharya, who's also joining us from India. She is the managing director and chief executive officer of the state-owned energy transition company, Convergence Energy Services Limited in India, and doing some really interesting work, entrepreneurial work, in mobilizing climate finance and private finance in the energy transition in India. We have Harish Hande, who's with us today, who is the founder of Selco India Solar Light Private Limited, co-founder and CEO of the Selco Foundation, who's been working on rural energy access and solar for 30 years and more. We have Jennifer Bokka, who's the head of responsible investment at Lekela Power in South Africa. We're very glad to have you from representing sort of the Pan-African utility scale investments in renewables, who has done a lot of remarkable work in ESG and pushing the standards for ESG in these investments. So that's a brief introduction. Let me start with Professor Sonia Klinsky, who will join us remotely.
Hi there, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me or not. I'm just going to try to share my slides. It worked a minute ago, so we're hoping it's going to work now. Just give me a moment here. First of all, I'd like to apologize for not being there in person. It would really be a lot more fun to be there with all of you, but I had literally just come to India for a few months, and it would have required kind of turning around and flying back immediately, and I didn't want to do that. So when Narasimhan and I were talking about this, it seemed like it might be useful to start with the super high global picture, but do this from a very practitioner perspective. These are some thoughts about where the equity conversation is in the UNFCCC right now, and that's what I'm going to kind of share with you to kind of give you a sense of where the conversation's at, and it has changed quite a bit in the last few years. I'm part of the equity working group of the Independent Global Stocktake. I'm one of the coordinators of that group. And our job is to basically be a shadow of the actual global stocktake, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And as part of that, we also then contribute into the process itself in terms of trying to understand where equity is and opportunities for embedding it more further. We're a mix of academics, negotiators, and civil society members of that group. And so we're actually kind of right in the weeds of the practice, if you will, of trying to embed equity into the UNFCCC. So I quickly just wanted to start here. This is an old cartoon, but one of my favorites. Note the date here, 1991. This goes back from a very famous report from the Center for Science and Environment that called out climate change as a case of new colonialism, new environmental colonialism. This sort of set the scene for many of the equity conversations going in the 1990s and into the 2000s, where there was a very strong north and south divide, a strong recognition of the need for thinking about atmospheric space, and a strong recognition of the tensions of ongoing development needs with climate. This led to, among other things, equity being very, very central in the initial legal framing of the UNFCCC. So we know from very beginning that equity comes as very crucial here, and we see that the parties should protect. Article 3 states that they should protect the climate system on the basis of equity and responsible with what now has become the central principle for equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now, I think what's important here just to think about this is there has been an evolution of this, and this is a big messy diagram, but I think it's kind of trying to set the scene a little bit for what's happened and what's happened in the discourse space and how the discourses around equity and around climate and around economic movements have shaped what's really ended up in the equity space. So if we start way back in the early 1990s, we had the UNFCCC come, we have these very, very profound differences in historical emissions and ongoing development pressures. We end up with CBDR-RC and equity being built into the fundamental framework of the convention. Kyoto Protocol comes along as the first real acting legal element of this. But at that time, there was very limited understanding of what the mitigation requirements really were. And at the same point, there was a real hesitancy around the geopolitics, especially from the richest countries, especially in the United States. So even in the lead up to this, we had the Byrd-Hagel resolution in the United States, which explicitly argued the United States would not take any major commitments unless the large economies such as India and China also took quantifiable emission obligations. The United States did not participate in Kyoto, and several other large players and important players pulled out, including Canada, before they would have been held accountable by international law. What you see in Kyoto is you have a firewall, a very clear, crisp differentiation between developed and developing countries as they are framed in that convention, and very limited global participation. So where it's interesting, a lot of really creative work happened in terms of thinking about principles of equity between the Kyoto and Copenhagen moments of time. There was a vast amount of literature from both practitioners and academics trying to think about how you would actually take equity principles and apply them to the central problems of climate. At the same time, this is where we start to understand more about mitigation and recognize that mitigation is going to be much more challenging than many had thought it was going to be. And there's immense pressure, especially on those in the global south, to have mitigation for everybody. In 2001, we start seeing things called NAMAs come up, which is real pressure on the global south to start doing mitigation domestically. Out of Copenhagen, many see this as a multilateral disaster. It depends on who you are, how you see Copenhagen. There's a little bit of a north-south divide in terms of the framing that gets used when talking about Copenhagen. But we ended up with a completely bottom-up arrangement. There were no equity principles. There was no way to actually build equity into any formal way of accounting for the way that the Copenhagen fell out. And there were totally insufficient targets in terms of what came out of Copenhagen. For many, this was a serious crisis of the multilateral system. And I know in the United States, that often is given less weight than it is in other parts of the world, partly because of the way in which the multilateral system is important or less important to any given actor. For those actors for whom the multilateral system remains a key source of support and recognition of the profound unfairness of climate, the crisis of multilateralism is a really real and felt situation. This led to Durban, which was an incredibly tense situation and very important from an equity conversation. Durban is important because it sets the framework for the Paris Agreement. It was the COP at which the rules for the Paris Agreement in terms of how it was going to be negotiated got laid down. And this is one of the most famous moments of this is the huddle, which happened because it could not reach agreement for over 24 hours after the end of the negotiations. And Todd Stern, the special envoy for the United States, is quite famously quoted as saying, "If equity's in, we're out." What we ended up with then was a framework that became the basis of the Paris Agreement that did not include the word equity. At no point in the Durban Accord was equity or justice mentioned. Instead, they fudged it by saying, under the convention. And so we had a very unusual and very tentative framing for the Paris Agreement, which on one hand did not include the words equity or justice or any recognition of equity in the international framework. On the other hand, it looked back to the UNFCCC text itself, which very explicitly recognized equity. And so going into the Paris negotiations, on one hand, equity was central and highlighted through the convention. On the other hand, it was rendered invisible. And so this is kind of where we end up in the Paris Agreement. We end up with a very odd kind of space in equity. It's a bottom-up agreement. It has very limited goals. It includes everybody, which was for many a big source of tension. And it has this thing called a ratchet mechanism, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is this idea of a global stocktake, which is what I'm involved in now in terms of thinking of how you would try to get more ambition. What's important here is this idea of that the global stocktake has to be conducted, quote, in light of equity. And that's where I want to start my conversation now. I just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of where this is all coming from. So this ratchet mechanism becomes very crucial in the Paris Agreement because the fundamental notion was that it was recognized that it was going to be insufficient, but the whole idea was that it would get more and more serious over time. And normally when people talk about this, you see gears. And I always think that's kind of funny because ratchets aren't really gears. Ratchets are a way of tightening something so it can't go backwards. And in fact, if you think about it, the idea of a gear suggests some sort of automatic process, but in fact, a ratchet is not an automatic process. A ratchet only works if you are able to get people to commit to increasingly high levels of commitment. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Going to go back. So what's really crucial here is the global stocktake. The global stocktake is supposed to be the engine of the Paris Agreement, which convinces people to take more ambitious action. And the entire global stocktake is supposed to be run, quote, in light of equity. And that's exactly where we are right now. Of course, where we are right now is completely inadequate levels of global commitments. And you'll see here in the kind of the salmon, this is where we are with current pledges. And if you look at the purple and the blue, it's where we would be for 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So just simply to echo the framing comments, we're very far from where we need to go. The current bottom-up pledges are completely insufficient to meeting this, which of course is a pressing equity issue because those who are going to be most harmed are those who have not traditionally contributed and those who have the fewest resources to deal with the fallout of this, which is going to be increasing climate impacts. This is where we are at with the current global stocktake and the conversations of equity, where 10 years ago, the conversation was focused on somewhat abstract principles for equity. The reality of the multilateral system and the kind of realpolitik has meant there's much less focus on theoretical principles of equity because we're in a situation where a whole bunch of other realities are kind of biting people. This is a point of practice rather than principle at this point. So where we are right now in the current negotiations in terms of in light of equity leading up to the global stocktake, we know that the NDCs do not add up to anything like adequate action. We have persistent gaps in energy access globally, which means we're kind of at a bit of a loggerheads in terms of how this circle is going to be squared. And as we've all been following, I'm sure many of you have been following the situation in terms of debates across Africa, in terms of what should be done in terms of access to fossil fuel and internal gas developments. This is going to be central at the COP, and this is one of the real kind of where the rubber hits the road equity issues. We have climate impacts that are rapidly increasing, and the costs of these are starting to become adding up to be very substantial numbers. And we also have increasing pressure to mitigate for everybody. This is a very clear line that goes right back to 2001. In terms of this idea that mitigation is a truly shared effort, which is fine, except that obviously not everyone has the equal capacity to do so. And net zero commitments start to raise some very pointed equity questions in terms of what those look like and the kinds of pressures being put on whom to do what. So all of this means that right now, from an equity perspective, the questions are changing a little bit. Really what it is, what does living well mean in a 1.5 or 2 degree world and what's there? And one of the things, I know this is a energy focused panel, but at the global level, you really can't talk about equity without talking about a package. So you have issues of mitigation and what a global just transition would be. And notice there's a big difference here between thinking about a domestic and global just transition. You can't separate that from adaptation and climate resilient pathways, partly because some of those things are going to require energy and they go back and forth. At the same time, loss and damage is becoming an inextricable part of this. So you cannot talk about equity at the global level without talking about profound and irreconcilable losses that are going to happen and how you deal with this. And of course, probably the most lively equity conversation at the global front right now is finance and means of support. So you cannot be expecting countries to be taking serious mitigation actions if they do not have the support and the resources to do so. So overall, I want to I know we're really short of time here and I don't want to take any extra time, but I want to return to this notion of the ratchet and what we really mean by a ratchet. And I think that one of the key things here is this idea of many different elements of equity. Oh dear, what had just happened? I didn't mean to do that. And one of those things is that there are many different, sorry, I have many things going on my screen. I actually can't see my screen because of the chat, but that's okay. There's many different sub-elements of equity, which is really where the conversation is. And so one includes, for instance, what would a just fossil fuel phase out look like? This does not fit the traditional kind of principles of equity approach, but is the kind of applied question that has huge equity implications. This issue of adequate support, what does it look like? How do you actually do it? Lots of conversations in terms of the fact there's actually resources in the global system that are not being accessed and how much is needed. The estimates right now are enormous. What would actually be needed to do this and what is allowed and not allowed to be counted as requirements of support for a globally just transition. All kinds of tensions here around what net zero means from an equity perspective. Is this net zero being talked about in terms of domestic net zero, where the emphasis is each country for themselves, which simply allows certain countries to avoid international obligations? And how would you account differently for international obligations by especially those in the global north? You have ongoing conversations about how you integrate whole packages of this such that you are able to have both mitigation and adaptation and the ways in which they integrate with each other. And the ongoing conversation about loss and damage, and it also has energy implications because it could also involve a whole variety of changes to energy systems. And probably the most pressing issue from an equity perspective is rethinking what international cooperation even means. The question of what kind of international cooperation is needed, who's responsible for it. These are actual very practical questions that are on the table right now. So that may be a kind of an odd way to kick this off, but I'm hoping that the focus here was to recognize that in the international equity space, what started as a very clear conversation about principles has moved into a much more diverse and much more grounded conversation in terms of the real practical needs that countries are facing as they try to figure out how they're going to navigate their commitments moving forward. With that, I'm actually not sure what my time is, so I'm going to end there and hope that I haven't run over and hand it over to Narasimha.
Thank you, Sonia. That was terrific. And that is a great way to kick this off, actually, because there's a lot of action that needs to take place at the local level. It's not going to happen unless we have action at the global level, so it's really important. I'd like to now invite Mahua Acharya to please join us also remotely.
Thank you, Narasimha. Thank you so much for having me at this event. And what a relevant topic you've picked. I don't have slides, but I've made some comments and thoughts around what I thought I'd share with the audience. And Sonia just very eloquently brought up the equity issue. So let me start first with, let me back up a little bit. What is steering India, and I'll respond on India for now. The overall goal was announced by, or the ambition was announced by the Prime Minister in Glasgow last year at COP. And he made 5 very ambitious announcements that India would go 50% of its electricity use would come from renewable energy and would have 500 gigawatts of renewable power, so on and so forth. And all of that ends up in a climate neutral or a net zero scenario by 2070. To be really honest, what is keeping people awake and what's keeping a lot of the government a little bit under stress is what happens between now and 2030, because all of the goals are in fact between now and 2030. There is a 2070 goal, but really that's a little far out in the future. So a lot of us are quite just wondering, what do we do with, how do we get to the 2030 goals? So as you know, solar power has developed very well in the last maybe 15 years or so. And it's not been without its share of problems. But solar now is becoming itself a problem created by itself. In other words, the ability of the grids to absorb more renewables is limited by additional renewables itself. So the grid is simply unable, in several distribution companies and utilities across the country, the level of infirm power is so high that we've got issues around balancing and penalties for deviating from the frequency band and so on and so forth. So there is a very active conversation going on around an energy transition, including having to field questions around why is India still mining coal? And really the answer lies in looking at the whole thing as a holistic package. Because even if this country were to add more renewables, the storage market and the energy transition section is not ready yet. And it's working it's being built up as I speak. What's then happened along the way is electric mobility has picked up. And it has picked up with a great amount of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement of the industry. The government is very much at the wheel. There's a lot of front-loaded incentives. And that system is picked up so rapidly and is picking up so rapidly that there are now discussions around what would happen to the grid if all these buses charged at the same time and if all of these vehicles charge at the same time. So that's a real conversation today. The other very real conversation, which is emerging, but it's a real issue, it's not yet a very real conversation. And this goes to the equity problem or the equity issue in some level, is how do we make the transition quote unquote just? And in other words, what happens to potential unemployment that may be created as we move away from coal? And I don't mean a phase out or a phase on, but there will be a gradual moving away from coal because renewables is just cheaper. So purely on the economic ground itself, there's a commercial obligation to move away. So there's a very active discussion there around what happens to the people that work in the mines when the mines shut down. That discussion has crept into the electric mobility space, because as far as public transit is concerned, as we move into electric buses and other forms of electric public transport, it's on a PPP structure. What happens to of drivers that are still otherwise in the utilities? Now, this is not a widespread problem, but it's an issue that is unique to some areas in the country, and they're big enough. To put this in perspective, all of Europe has 7,000 electric buses, and India in the last tender was 5,500. And as I speak today, we've just released another tender for 6,000 buses. And the national target that we've been asked to make good on is 50,000 electric buses. And getting to 50,000 does not seem to be a problem, because the prices that we have discovered in the last tender were so competitive, they're cheaper than diesel, that there's just no reason why people would not move their buses over. So that discussions around driver redundancy and employment are very real. So in the context of all of this, where does the financial system sit? And that's a very broad question, and I really find it difficult when people ask that. But what I mean is, at the highest level, finance has to be moving towards the kind of economy we want. So in other words, interest rates, the cost of capital, the tenor of capital, and the regulations that surround capital should reflect the green economy we're heading towards. But that's not the case in India. It's not the case anywhere in the world yet. But that is something that needs to be addressed. So there are emerging saplings of discussions around taxonomy and what constitutes green and what is a bond and what should its proceeds go for, and so on and so forth. But the discussion is deeper than that. For money to come in, and a lot of new money coming in from outside the country is coming with an ESG tag, and we don't have a global definition for ESG. We don't have a global definition for what constitutes net zero. So there's a lot of things that need to be done at the same time. That said, the government is very much at the wheel, though, because the electric vehicle discussion is moving from the government's very much at the wheel. There are discussions around a domestic emissions trading scheme that's coming up, and for which the legal architecture has been amended and is being amended. That's coming up. So there are lots of these discussions that are extremely real, and they're taking place almost every day. And every day there's a new guidance being developed somewhere. But the aspirations are incredibly high. And again, I go back to the original targets between now and 2070 is not really the benchmark. The yardstick is between now and 2030. And how does India make good on its 2030 commitments? So this country is being driven by these so-called shorter term goals. And final thought is in order to transition for a developing country as big as India, for a country whose legacy systems are as deep as in India, a lot of the business models have to be locally cooked. And they have to be, it seems very obvious to say indigenous, but they're very real. Figuring out a business model where you have to keep people employed without being regulated about it, it's a very real conversation. It happens in mergers and acquisitions across Europe, and governments will not let you make investments or acquisitions unless you use a local employment base, and you cannot hire and you cannot fire, and so on and so forth. So there's a bit of that. There's a lot of that precedence all over the world. But here, that's a very real discussion, because what do we do with the people? So the issues around social equity, the issues around integration have to be built into business models that we don't have yet. And we're discovering them as we speak. In fact, Narsima, you were saying that, there's a fair bit of entrepreneurial work going on. I'd say, that entrepreneurial work is necessary. From where I sit inside the government, unless you're disruptive, you don't get transformation at scale, at a speed enough that keeps all the states happy and justifies the effort for a place as big as this country. So on that front, on that note, I'll stop for a bit and happy to take questions, comments, whatever comes up along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahua. That's really thought-provoking, thinking about the scale of the problems that we have in a country as big as India, seeing the tension between the new technologies that are getting commercially viable, disruptive innovation, but you also have legacy and millions of workers you have to think about. So makes for a very challenging environment. Can I invite Jen now to speak from her experiences in Africa?
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Bocha. I work for a company called Lekela Power. Really delighted to be here this afternoon to share with you guys some of the work we're doing in Africa. It's really a timely conversation that we'll be having about the just energy transition. We've talked a lot about this climate emergency and the goals that we need to meet to get there. And also we want to make sure that as we transition, that this is going to be an inclusive growth that we pursue. And so I'd like to share some of our experiences trying to do this in Africa, and in particular in South Africa. So this picture here shows you how much work we need to do to electrify Africa. It always keeps me awake at night when I see something like this, because the challenges are immense. And it's not just the power challenges that we face. I think you've talked about the number of people that don't have access to electricity in the world, and actually nearly 500 million of these people are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the challenges are big for us. And Africa is an incredibly attractive growth proposition in terms of renewables. We have a lot of resources, both wind and solar, and yet, it's still very much a dark continent in that regard. This situation is further compounded by the economic context. So it's not just the lack of power that we have. We've seen since COVID, GDP in Africa go down quite dramatically in the last few years. We have challenges around urbanization, youth unemployment, lack of innovation. We have very high populations predicted to grow to probably 2.5 billion people by 2050. So really many challenges that we are facing. And in terms of how much power we have that's powered by renewable. As you can see there, we're still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Around 77% of Africa is still powered by fossil fuels. And we only have about 3% installed renewables, compared to the rest of the world. So this is where Lekela comes in. Our mission really is to energize Africa's sustainable future. We strongly believe that businesses like ours have an opportunity to contribute. So we do utility scale renewables. So that means large scale grid injected projects. We're Africa's largest pure renewables independent power producer. Currently, we have around 1,000 megawatts of operational assets from South Africa, Egypt, and Senegal. As you can see there, South Africa is our largest market, and we have a big pipeline across the continent. And yeah, very excited to be able to deploy large-scale projects across the continent. At the heart of what we do is this really big commitment around ESG, and this really speaks to how we're tackling the just energy transition story. Lekela is a top-rated ESG performer. This is something we've chosen deliberately to do. Even though we're a power company, we understand the markets in which we are operating. Power is a big problem, but beyond that, we have many socioeconomic development challenges. And one of our key pillars is actually around impact. And how we look at this is we try to align ourselves with the United Nations SDGs. We are very intentional about it. We have a community investment strategy at group level that really tries to unpack, as a company operating in Africa, how can we further positive impact? So we've identified 3 areas where we focus on. Education and skills development, which really speaks a lot to the just transition story and how we can further skill communities to be able to partake. Enterprise development and job creation, given the scale of youth unemployment across our markets, and environment and energy access. Today, I really wanted to speak briefly about South Africa because I believe it is kind of showing the way in terms of how you can tackle the question of just energy transition. It is the largest electricity market in Africa, and also, as I said, it's the biggest market for us as Lekela. As you can see there, South Africa has been trying to move away from coal. At the moment, they are nearly 70% powered by fossil fuels, and they have a target of reducing this to about 30% by 2030. And so in 2011, they set up what they call the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program. We call it the REAP for short. And what they're trying to do is really deploy renewables at scale. What is peculiar and really interesting about this procurement program is that it's not just looking at procuring energy, it's also looking at how they can do this in a just manner. And so how they, when you bid for projects as an independent power producer, the way they'll assess your bid is based on 2 elements. They will look at price, so 70% of the evaluation is based on price, and 30% of it is based on what socioeconomic development you can bring with your proposals. So it's these elements that I wanted to talk a little bit about because those elements speak to South Africa's need for just energy transition. So they want you to say how you're going to create jobs. And we say job creation here, we mean how many women are you going to employ? How many local people from within 50-kilometer radius of your development are you going to employ? How many of those are going to be skilled? How many of them are non-skilled? So it really forces you as a private company to really think through your proposals. It's about local content, how much of your technology and components can be manufactured locally. The more you can manufacture locally, the more you can procure locally, the more you can have local ownership, the more your bid can qualify. There's also other elements around management control. In South Africa, obviously, given their legacy, there's a lot of social inequalities. They want to try and encourage more Black people to become entrepreneurs. So there's a real big opportunity there for companies to actually go out and look for partnerships in communities, encourage communities to come on board and be part owners of these projects. So this REAP criteria doesn't kind of just come out of the blue. It's very much aligned to their national development plan. And so you can see some of the outcomes they're trying to see. For example, they want decent employment through inclusive growth. What that means is that they will have sub-criteria within the procurement program that is actually trying to address those specific issues. So for example, the job creation objectives, the enterprise development and procurement is just really trying to address some of those challenges so that they can align with their national development outcomes. So to date, I just wanted to share a little bit how we are performing as an industry. What is interesting, when we started bidding for these projects as private sector, we always said, we're not good at socioeconomic development. We are power players. We don't know how to do this. But actually what's happened is that we are overperforming on every single metric of these indicators. So just quickly there to show you. So for example, on localization, we had a target of 45% and we're already tracking at 50%. So that means a lot of manufacturing is happening on the ground in South Africa. In terms of employment, these projects are overperforming. We have over 91% of the people employed on these projects coming from South Africa, overperforming on local community members that actually work on these projects during construction. In terms of employment equity, we've seen local communities, Black citizens in South Africa and the youth in particular really benefit from these programs. Women are also encouraged heavily. We have a lot of programs where we're trying to encourage females to participate, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go too much into the detail of, the exact objectives and how they're performing, because what I have is a little video that actually brings all of this to life. And also just to say that, South Africa obviously has got its own context in terms of a just energy transition. And I think for every country or every continent, that story is going to be different. But I think what their system shows is that it is possible to actually make sure that this transition can be just. I mean, I've been to communities there that I visited 5 years ago, and now that we are operational and spending money in these communities, you can see a dramatic difference, in livelihoods. And so I hope it's a great template for other countries and other organizations to look at. And I will let you play the video because I think it brings it to life more than I could probably explain myself. Is it working?
Yeah.
I should start from the beginning. It's kind of halfway through.
Yeah, the relevant.
Sorry.
Yeah, the relevance of renewables has been that nowadays obviously there's a green agenda, and that's an important part of what we do at Yale. But equally important for us is trying to build economically priced electricity, supplying it to countries that desperately need electricity to grow.
My name is Milis Wamlokoti, the plant manager for Kangnas Wind Farm, which is situated about 48 kilometers east of Springbok in the Northern Cape. The plant is made up of 61 turbines, 2.3 megawatt Siemens Gamesa turbines, that gives us a clean energy of 140 megawatts, which electrifies about 150,000 or so households.
Yale has been able to develop a portfolio of over 1,000 megawatts of projects in South Africa, in Senegal, and in Egypt. We were set up in 2015, and in that short period, we've been able to become the largest independent power producer that's doing purely renewables in Africa. We feel that we have a responsibility to make sure that this green economy that we're transitioning towards doesn't leave anyone behind, and that we can share as much as possible the benefits from the transition.
We work very closely with the communities in which we operate, and so we've got long-term investment into a country, and it gives us the opportunity to really make radical improvements in those communities, investing in things like education and healthcare and enterprise, importantly.
In a remote town like this, opportunities and access to information and opportunities are limited. Education gives that foundation for learners and the community as a whole to actually venture outside the town, venture beyond the norm. And they can't get there without something as basic as education.
I can tell you, Kangnas, the wind farm, green energy, has a deep footprint in the short time that it's here in our communities.
We have supported our schools with Wi-Fi, interactive whiteboards, as well as a bursary program.
We now can move away from the chalk and talk teaching, which is a death knell to a child, and do the blended teaching, where we can give them live examples of things using the whiteboard. So Kangnas pushed us into the digital age.
We started with 10 food gardens at schools, at creches, and home gardens as well.
We started this vegetable garden because we encountered poverty in our area. When there's no food in the kitchen, like there's no cabbage, and then we have the spinach in order to cook for the children. All the kids from grade R up to grade 7, every child is getting fed.
So I see the Lourdsfontein hub to be buzzing with life, and the community owning it and enjoying it. From a social perspective, the workshops, the training, youth activities, that's what we see this place to have the potential for.
It's just been hugely exciting to be able to deliver these projects, and especially in the markets where we operate. And really, it's a clear testament to the fact that Africa can be powered by renewables, and that renewables really do have a role to play. They can be cheap, they can be reliable, and obviously they are clean. So I think it's been such an amazing story to be involved in Lekela.
Thank you very much. That was interesting to see that actually the project bids are being evaluated, not just on the basis of price, but some of these socioeconomic impacts. And now, can I invite Harish to please speak to us about energy access and rural development?
Thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me here, Nasiman. No, I was thinking, what should I say here? I think much of the world is actually not serious. The multilaterals, the bilaterals are really not serious. If people were serious, even if 10% of them were serious, we would have solved the solution by now. Because for many of the negotiators and many of the people who discuss around the world, it's career for them. And people who suffer, it's life for them. And they don't meet. People whose life are suffering are not on the negotiating table at all. And people who are negotiating actually don't suffer from climate in many ways because they move on. Truly, we have not solved this issue in 2022. And we still negotiate and negotiate and negotiate and go from one COP to another COP. And I think that's where the issue is. Come on. If 750 million people do not have electricity and we were able to vaccinate X amount of millions during the 2 years, we would have been serious enough. And that's because we don't know what implementation actually means for many. And so it's always from one, so as a prank, what I do is, there's a presentation I did in 1992, and I show it in different COPs, and don't say it's a 1992 presentation. And a lot of people think it's a new one. That shows how it's people come and go, the institutions remain, and there's no legacy that passes on that we have done this and failed and failed and failed. And people say we need to learn from failings. Where will institutions learn from failings? Because the people have changed, right? And it does not. I mean, if you, and so for every half a penny that I kept for the millions that were promised from 1992, I would have made $1 billion by now. So this shows that, like, if Tanzanians, Sierra Leone's in poor parts of India, right? If we are not able to come up with a good solar-powered blacksmith blower, and mind you, the amount when we keep talking of clean cooking, you're tired from 1992 to hear about clean cooking. There are more papers written on clean cooking that I don't have enough cook stoves to burn them on, right? Because this is the issue is, look at, and when we talk about 2 billion people without energy access, X amount of health centers not being put up, these are very simple solutions that we could not solve. Something is wrong somewhere. These are not complicated rocket science. Your iPhone 14 has come up. Every version of iPhone, Microsoft changed from the old DOS to now this, and we've not been able to provide energy access to more than half the humanity. Simple thing, Sierra Leone, 6 million people, 2% electrified, highest maternal deaths in the world, 1,100 for every 100,000, the basic form of humanity of delivering a baby that we could not solve. Shouldn't we be guilty enough for that? Shouldn't we not ask ourselves, why is it not happening? Simple, providing the best maternal services to each and every individual in this world, we've not been able to solve it. That's equity. That's injustice, inequity in many ways, right? And we are still talking about it. We are analyzing it. And the worst form is we analyze it on the basis of an Excel sheet. How in an Excel sheet will tell us what is the value of a baby lost in Sierra Leone or in India? We're going to decide on economics. Parts of the bilateral with multilateral, which I was talking about, I was telling a professor a couple of days ago, can't name the multilateral, on saying that how private money will solve Somalia's health issues. Then I asked a simple question. Tell me one country in the world where healthcare is truly private. And we're talking of private money to solve Somalia's healthcare. None of the airports make money in the world. None of the airports make money, they are public assets. I think today we confuse between market economics, we confuse between what needs to be done in terms of how this is the play of privatization on basic human needs that the world requires. And I think it can be solved with there is enough capital, there's enough talent, there's enough resources, and only one thing that is missing is willpower. And that's missing, absolutely missing. I heard the same number in 1992 when we started. I hear the same number today in 2022. So it's high time to the youngsters, I'm telling you, please get into these institutions and disrupt them. Don't take it for granted that I'm in an institution. Don't get into the comfort zone of traveling business class and going to a country, and then after that, write it in a resume. I visited Somalia and I did a program for Somalia. Don't make it a resume-based thing in this world of development. And so for me, it's frustrating sometimes to hear many a time that we're going to have another COP soon in Egypt. We're going to again talk about equity and injustice. We are actually negotiating whether the word should be included at all. And we're all quiet. We're all quiet about it. And that, the energy access, energy equity, the development, like if 7 people in this world, and mostly men, who have as much as what 3 billion people own in this world, how has market economics changed in many ways? That's where I want all of you to go and stand up and say, solutions exist. Some need to be innovated. And no, please do not, I'll tell you a simple thing, blacksmith blower. It's not a sexy enough innovation to write in your resume. And that's why it's never got innovated. A high efficient silk weaving machine that 20% of this world actually works on. How many people actually work on that? How many people work on a very high efficient, resource poor dental chair that can actually be folded, run on a solar, and delivered at the doorstep of the poor? These are exciting things to actually work on. But when you ask GE, for example, GE would say, and this is the vice president of GE would say, efficiency is not our goal. Our goal is to provide higher number of variations of an X-ray machine, but how do you design for a resource poor area? And that is what the 60% of this world needs on, and can be done. For example, today when I design solar for a sewing machine, people actually say solar is expensive. Nobody says the sewing machine is inefficient. Because inefficiency is the best friend of grid. Because we confuse between CapEx, OpEx, and OpEx. And solar is a combination of CapEx and OpEx, while grid is only about OpEx. And you youngsters should challenge that economics and say, what is cheap? What is expensive? What is externalities? Because we get stuck up in the whole concept of semantics. Mitigation versus adaptation. What do you go and tell to the person in rural Tanzania whose farms have been flooded, or in Assam? I'm sorry, we are working on mitigation, no longer an adaptation. Are we going to sit there in front of him and tell? I'm going to go and tell the Sierra Leonese lady and said, wait, we are still working on a new maternal labor room. We have not yet designed because equity is not in the negotiating table. How many of you are guilty? How many of you can talk? That's when I say that you have solutions. So Professor said that I should say what I work on. I work on, so 30 years ago, started an organization called CELCO, basically to disprove 3 myths: that the poor can't afford technologies, poor can't run technologies, and the third is you can't run a commercial venture while trying to meet social objectives. So CELCO India today has 800 people. We have 60 offices in rural India. We've reached out to around 2 million households and approximately 50 to 80,000 institutions like churches, temples, hospitals. And 80% of these are financed by different financial institutions. And I would say it's owned by three investors, and all of them foundation, but it's been profitable for the last 16 years. And I'm proud to say my colleague who runs the organization now made it profitable during COVID. It was the only solar rural company to have been profitable during COVID, because the way he decentralized operations, where 99% of my colleagues actually come from the client base themselves, the 800 of them. So when you create an enterprise that meets the needs of the end users, and most of the end users are the employees of the organization, you can make it profitable, sustainable, and long-term durable for the society, as long as the society believes that this organization is actually theirs. So I stepped out in 2012 to create a foundation, basically saying that in CELCO India, we learned a lot of failures, and how can non-English speakers across the world get an ecosystem approach of development. And a lot of the failings that we had in CELCO India, didn't want a lot of the youngsters to, in Tanzania or in a northeast part of India, to repeat the mistakes we had done in CELCO India. And that's why we created the whole concept of CELCO Foundation. The concept of CELCO Foundation is very simple. Like the biggest subsidy Google got is the internet. Google didn't pay for the internet. And if internet collapses today, Google collapses. And the concept of CELCO Foundation is to create an ecosystem for energy access to flourish, energy entrepreneurs in the rural areas to flourish, energy innovations like a blacksmith blower or a hammer mill or a pottery maker, all to be powered using solar. How do you make a dental chair that can be given to the rural community in the rural path, that can be folded, or it could be an autoclave, a suction pump, it could be a projector in rural parts. How do you use decentralized energy to democratize the delivery of health, education, and livelihoods? That's what we do in the foundation. Thank you, Professor, for giving me this time.
Thank you, Harish, for keeping it real. I invited you to this panel for a good reason, and I wanted us to hear hard truths. So where do we go from here? I have a number of questions I'd like to ask, just to start off a discussion. So we've heard there's a lot of activities on the ground, promising activities at various scales, at the rural scale, but also at the grid scale, positive developments, commercially viable investments in renewables. But we've also heard there's going to be a point where these aren't scalable without further financial support. We have barriers in the grid for incorporating more renewables. Storage is expensive. We think about freight transport, think about industry. These are sectors that are already expensive to decarbonize even in industrialized countries. So at some point, we need to think about finance flows potentially at a global scale. So I wanted to ask you, if we were in an ideal world, we actually now in the next COP are able to mobilize some finance, Green Climate Fund, you have money starting to trickle in the billions when we need trillions. How are we going to bridge scales and how are we going to create solutions that are meeting the needs of the poor, that in your ideal world, in your space, are going to be implementable, meet the needs of accountability and measurability for funders, but also really address the needs of people? So I'm thinking all the way, from the global climate negotiation scale, following the money. If you want to understand the world and solve problems, follow the money. How can we create solutions across scales that actually propagate down to meet the needs of people? So how does that going to, what's the best outcome in terms of the negotiations at COP, in terms of the negotiations of contracts for grid-connected renewables, and then of course in terms of all of the off-grid projects that are going on, the flow of finance, how can we make them real if we had that opportunity? Who wants to start from their perspective?
Happy to try. I think, as I said, from an African perspective, the issue is not just power, right? Here we're looking at socioeconomic development across the board. And so when we talk about financing, it's not just about financing the transition. I think Sonia asked a really good question in terms of how we're going to phase out from fossil fuels. For Africa, we're not even phasing out, we haven't even started. So I think there'll have to be a discussion around what kind of mix needs to be financed. It might involve some fossil fuels because, as we've spoken many times here, Africa is suffering from the impacts of climate change, but we haven't caused it, right? And we haven't developed yet. And I don't know that there's any country in the world that's been able to develop without having some fossil fuels in the mix. And it's a little bit controversial, but it is the truth for a lot of developing countries. We will need some form of, for example, natural gas, for example, to be able to even inject renewables into our grids. We will need some sort of baseload power. So I think the discussions will be very, specific to the context of, the different places. But for Africa in particular, it is much wider than investing in renewables. It's really thinking about development, industrialization, just pulling people out of poverty and what that means for the continent in terms of, what do we finance and how do we finance it? Thanks.
So I think, the question is, just a simple question. How many of you bought a house on a credit card? None, right? And we expect the poor in Africa and Asia to actually buy assets on high interest rates. And that's exactly, if the only way to get poor out of poverty is actually have asset-based financing, just how roads and airports are financed. And that's absent. And that's absent for much of the poor in South Asia, Africa. And today, if you look at in Rwanda, the Rwandan minister told me, Harish, the World Bank catches us by like this and say the interest rates are, by the time we get the money from the World Bank, it's around 9 to 8%, plus inflation, plus the currency risk. By the time the end user gets it, it's around 35%. The poor get it at 45%. How can we actually make sure that the poor actually get a rice mill, which is an asset equivalent to you and me buying a house? And we're telling a poor in Zimbabwe or in Sierra Leone or in rural India to actually buy a rice mill on 45% interest rates. That means he or she has to make enough of profits to equivalent to 65%. Except the Colombian drug lords, nobody else makes 65% in terms of money. How are we actually thinking until low -% financing happens? Because the ultimate benefit for the world is to get poor out of poverty. And that's the financial cost of that poverty is much more than what today we talk about this financial sustainability. If we have to get Africa, South Asia, where most of the poor, we need to come up with financing that's equivalent to financing roads and airports. And that's absent. That's not there even on the negotiating table. So where are we going to go forward? Until people start creating asset-based financing, it's not going to happen.
Rahul and Sonia, do you want to weigh in? Thinking about finance and how you think you should
Sure.
mobilize solutions?
Go ahead, Sonia.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go
Go
ahead.
next.
No, go.
Financing is a function of it's a function of two things. Is the sector commercially viable, and then are the projects even bankable? So it fundamentally is that. And then to answer the first one, is the sector viable? I can make a project nice and I can structure it, but the affordability of, for example, power or a ticket or whatever is submerged, then no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to get money into that project. Certainly not at scale. I'm only talking about scale. I'm not talking about anything niche. So the project may be absolutely fine. It'll be de-risked. But if the power price is just lower than the needs of that capital, the capital is never going to come in. So on the other hand, and Harish will know this really well, in the off-grid electricity market, people pay 3 times, 4 times what a consumer like me pays for power on a per unit basis. And as a function of their monthly income, it's a very high percentage. So this tells me that they're really wanting that power and they're willing to pay for it. But then the risks in the whole sector are so high that large scale capital doesn't come in. So that's what I mean, is the sector even commercially viable? So what a lot of governments should do, and they are doing, but they should do more of, is just figure out large scale structures. I'm currently a big fan of PPPs because that structure works for large scale finance, for financing roads, financing ports, financing airports, where the governments are now increasingly public mobility, what I've been spending some time on, where the job of the government is then very different. It doesn't own the asset, it doesn't spend money into it, except it spends its role in being part of a system that enables money to come in. It sounds very utopian, but it's been done before. It's been done for infrastructure. It's been done in the US for the road system a lot. So there's a lot of things to learn from. And this question around where will the financing come from is really a function of, is the sector even commercially viable or not? And if it's not, then the government has to step in. If the demand is submerged or subdued, the government would have to step in. So the government's role should really be that of an enabler, particularly for finance.
So, shall I continue, or did you want to say something?
I'll be very quick just to jump in here if you want. Just in terms of the negotiations on finance, it's, in the equity group, we kind of play an inside-outside role. And there are some things in the finance conversation that, because of the way that the UNFCCC is structured, it's almost impossible to get into the negotiations, but are actually the kinds of changes that would be needed. So debt relief, fundamentally changing what is paid to whom and how. These are some of the larger things that are very hard to get into the negotiations. The negotiations often end up talking about finance as though it's only for private finance or finance that's going to flow through existing channels. But we know when you add up the costs that there's simply it's not going to be adequate. There's no way, especially for increasing calls for grants rather than loans, that this is going to be the global developed countries are not going to finance these, unfortunately, without massive public pressure. And I have no idea where that public pressure is going to come from. So this is an issue that when you look at the numbers, it's very hard to imagine how we're going to end up at a more equitable finance structure without very serious, purposeful political mobility across both north-south lines, because I don't see how it's going to come up any other way. The other thing about the finance conversation, and then which I think is important, is it's not just about numbers. So there are pots of money that aren't being accessed. There's all kinds of conditionalities. You can't even get your hands on the money, even though it's just sitting there. So when you think about finance, it's not only the actual money, it's how do you actually get it to the people who need it. So it's a little more complicated than just adding up the numbers.
So let me push on this issue. I want to ask about institutions. So we think about what institutions are currently governing the activities in this sector. We're seeing a large involvement of international donors who seem to be spearheading in aspects of clean energy, serving rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa a lot, in South Asia a lot. We need low-cost finance. We don't want the poor to be buying assets on very, very high interest rates. Mahua is saying we need capital to be affordable, for the sector to be viable. So it makes me think of the role of governments, the role of national governments. Also in terms of the grid, we were talking earlier, Jennifer, that you may be able to build solar farms, but then how do you get them to people without extending the grid or having adequate amount of scale in your decentralized systems? So I want to ask you all, what is the ideal role of government, national governments, local governments, in really accelerating equitable solutions beyond where we are now? What is working about the role of government? What needs to change and improve about the role of government?
Shall I take it?
Yeah. Please.
So the question, see, sometimes I think in this sector, and especially looking at development, climate, poverty, the financial sustainability has to be generational. It cannot be from a project-based financing, as we tend to do. I mean, just simple example being the United States education system, where you have free education till the 12th. That means a kid who gets educated, he or she in the future, because it's educated till 12th, is going to earn something, pay taxes, leading to the subsidization of the next set of kids. So the financial viability is over generations, right? It's not like, is this kid going to pay for himself? It's about generation. Same way, climate change and poverty. I mean, I go back to what the government of India did actually in 1970. I was telling in a class yesterday, when India was starving, what happened was the banks were nationalized and forced to create 40% of financing for the farmers in the rural areas, and parallelly the vocational schools were funded to teach the youngsters how to sell fertilizer as well as water pumps, and the ecosystem that was required by the farmers to grow food. Through the banking system, they were financed for seeds, the market linkages were created, and the vocational schools were created to do that ecosystem. And that's exactly what we need to do on energy revolution. Long-term financing, 5 to 8 and 10-year financing for the farmers to buy water pumps on long-term assets. Same thing, and capital excess. The World Banks and the IFCs and the multilaterals have to change the way, because they suddenly brought in the Wall Street type of thinking process. They are long-term development banks. They've forgotten their original role, that they are long-term development banks. And there is nothing to be negotiated, unfortunately. Then let the Europeans not complain about the migrants that are coming from Africa. Because they hold the truth to what the World Bank is. Let them negotiate and create multiple. Sierra Leone, Mali, all can be solved before 2030 SDGs. Capital exists, but the way we define commercial viability has to change. It's a long-term commercial viability.
Long-term makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What about on the grid level, electrifying transport, extending the grid? What has been the role of government? What should be the future role? It's different.
From a private sector perspective, I think you touched on an important point about long-term planning. To attract investors in this space, we need to get a very clear, sense of direction. Where does the country want to go? How many megawatts do they want to deliver that are renewables? And what's that process going to look like? Because, it takes us nearly 5 to 7 years to deliver a project. The development pipeline takes a long time. It's capital intensive. You need to know whether there's grid connection available. And in a lot of these countries, the grid infrastructure belongs to the country. It's a strategic asset. Private players typically don't get involved in grid. And as I was mentioning before, we're talking about generation, and actually, I personally think generation is not a problem. We can develop these projects, but we can't distribute, we can't transmit, and sometimes you're actually getting, like in Kenya, we've had this Lake Turkana, one of the biggest wind farms in Africa, stranded for nearly 18 months because the government could not build the transmission line. So I think there's a lot of discussions to be had, with governments in terms of intentionality and planning and the good policy and regulatory frameworks to send up, a good signal to industry and investors that, this is the strategy here. South Africa is a good case in point. As I said, the REAP gives us a very clear sense of direction. There's still many challenges. They're still not investing enough in grid, but it forces you to be in the same room and understand where the bottlenecks are. But grid is a big, big challenge.
Sonia, do we want to jump in, or shall I ask the next question? Sorry, Mahua and Sonia, would you like to say something, or shall I jump to the next question? Either way is fine.
No, go ahead. I think
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have 10 minutes. I wanted to give all of you a chance to ask questions. I'll hold off on some of mine if you don't have any. I doubt that'll be the case. Please, does anyone have a question? We can also take questions from the virtual audience if there are any, but I'll give preference to those who are here. Up there in the back, and then you. Yeah, all the way in the back, by the window.
Thank you so much for this really interesting discussion. And I apologize, I came a little bit late, so this perhaps was touched on already, but I was curious to know about the panelists' opinions on initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative or GuideCo, which I think is like the Global Energy Infrastructure Development Cooperation Organization, where I actually haven't really heard much about these initiatives at all since the onset of the pandemic and don't know where they stand. But for these instances where there is arguably a tremendous amount of political will and financing, how can we leverage these kinds of initiatives that are really geopolitically tense and make sure that these that the transitions that are proposed in the infrastructure is actually democratized and incorporates principles of environmental justice, or are initiatives that are inherently on such a large scale capable of overseeing that kind of transition?
Global scale infrastructure, multinational projects like Belt and Road Initiative, GuideCo, it's global grid to serve Asia and Europe, or the International Solar Alliance one might think of. What do you think about the governance of those, the feasibility, impact of those systems? Anyone want to? Well, let's take a few questions and then we can let the panelists mull over them. First, you still have a question?
Yeah, it's on. It's off.
Thank you. I want to highlight your call for honesty and pragmatism at some point, and also highlight the point of the need for importance amount of capital, but also the efficient use of that capital to achieve the investments that are expected to happen at some point. I also want to highlight one of your points that mentioned the high returns of capital of drug dealers in Colombia. And I think that is an excellent example of things that needs to be clarified. I'm actually from Colombia. And I'm taking this as an example for the next reason. Many times, yes, you target very easy countries or labels exist, right? And you don't go on deep behind those labels. So in the case of illegal drugs, you can think that the higher returns are happening in Colombia. Actually, the social costs are also happening in this country, right? And not only that, but the higher returns of that capital are not, as in many value chains, are not happening in the origin of these agricultural products like the coca leaf, but actually it's happening when the commercialization is taking place. So to say it in the consumer countries, right? But anybody talks about those capitals and those higher returns and the people that is behind those black markets. And the way that I'm trying to connect this is, in your call of honesty, do you think that there is some kind of institutions or organisms that take advantage of climate crisis? Like I'm thinking, or there are some kind of black markets behind, and I'm not thinking like in these, conspiration theories or things like that, but just to give you an example, we were discussing this morning about migration. There are a lot of black markets on migration, right? There are people who benefit of that migration. So I just wondering, in this call of honesty, a part of the reform of the traditional institutions that exist and regulate many things, do you think that we need to think some other kind of layers or, black markets potentially? I don't know.
I'll take one more question, then I'll ask the panelists to respond. I can't remember who, maybe this gentleman here.
Thanks. My question was really for Jennifer. The work that you're doing in renewables in Africa is amazing at that scale of 1,000 megawatts. But obviously it's in the big economies in South Africa, Kenya, Egypt. From the perspective of a company like yours, what's the barriers to being able to do it in Burkina Faso or in Sierra Leone or places that have much more energy poverty?
So I invite anyone to go first. Sonia Moho, I'll let you go first if you want to say something.
Sure, I think I'll try and comment on the first question, which is actually it's a very tough, it's very hard to respond to that because initiatives like the Belt and Road, a lot of international organizations as well, they're often political compromises. And so when you start with something that is probably a political compromise, very difficult then to get every other objective buried in there. The Belt and Road Belt and Road initiative comes with its own money. And let's be honest and clear, it's quite unidirectional. It's a Chinese initiative, and it's seen like that as well. It's the case with a lot of multilateral organizations, especially the new ones, the ones that have been formed in the last 15 years. They come out of a political compromise. So they're not often born with all of those objectives. And then we spend a lot of time trying to retrofit them to make them meet objectives of the people that occupy these places after they were born. And that's where tension arises. So it's a tough question to answer, but not likely to get all of these environmental objectives and social objectives coming out of these large-scale initiatives because they came up for a very different purpose.
Yeah, makes sense. Others on the other questions?
So I'll pick up. The question is, I think today, a lot of the designs are done from a supply side and not from a demand side. Right, and for example, any country is doing, I'm going to do X megawatts of renewable energy. Nobody's asking the question for what, right? Nobody's asking what is it for? Like, oh, I want to put solar water pump. I said, what's the problem statement where the answer would have been a solar water pump, right? The problem statement is irrigation, not solar water pump. And it's like, for example, if I have to design for this building, if this building did not exist, the energy that was required would have been calculated much more if the daylighting didn't exist, right? First, let's design, do we need this building? How should it be designed? And then after that, look at what the energy input is. But today, we design on the supply side and then see what the demand is going to be. So then we lose out on the efficiency of appliances, efficiency of utilization, like water pump. Why should I do solar water pumps for sugarcane in low water tables? First, the crop itself is the wrong crop, should be millets. But we jump on doing that, let's do 10,000 water pumps, for example. So how can we get to and convince schools like Yale, MIT, how do you bring in program design thinking? rather than having everything, okay, well, we all go with a solution, try to fit a problem to it, right? How do you reverse that thought process? And that's where many of these designed is from, okay, I think these millions of people need that much of energy. I think we need to reverse it. Efficiency, appliances, maternal labor rooms, design, and then you suddenly see that you need half the energy. And that's for, so regarding your honesty question, the question is, you're right, it's not about black market. Unfortunately, what happens is, it's like when we really look at serving the poor and creating assets, right? We are saying that we need it at scale. Why? Because so I can meet the transaction cost at the top, because of the huge salaries at the top, right? To meet those transaction costs of overheads, I have to actually increase the interest rates. That's why there's a big disconnect between the designers of the programs and their cost structure to the users of the programs and their cost structure. So the only way the poor can pay, if there are millions of the poor, because that's where the transaction cost is. We need to break that cycle. Until that cycle is not broken, you're going to have lots of overheads of these multilaterals. And the only way that transaction cost, then we quote commercialization of it, is when you charge higher interest rates or make it million. So it's no economics can actually show this can be connected. And nobody's trying to break that because everybody has gone into the comfort zone. And how these youngsters go and break that cycle? The cycle has to be broken, otherwise the world's social sustainability is at stake. And climate is actually going to make it worse. The transaction cost has to be delivered. It's like, oh, the world, yeah, that's what it costs in New York, that's what in Washington, that is what it costs in Delhi. Oh, sorry, Harish, that's not an excuse. You need to deliver services at the affordable rates to the poor and work reverse. That means you're not the right person to lead it.
So I wanted to add a point related to what Harish said. That hasn't come up yet. There actually are informal markets for providing energy access in sub-Saharan Africa that we haven't talked about. There's a lot of dominance of the donor-led developments, but there are a lot of small players that are catering to lower income markets that are less regulated, less known. Perhaps the life of those equipment aren't as long. We don't understand a lot about them, but there are those informal markets that exist. It would be really important to understand the contribution of them and how to actually make them, scale them as well. Anybody else wanted to respond, or Jennifer, did you want to respond?
There was a question around the countries that we pick, right? So as I said, so we do utility scale projects, which means that our counterparty on the government side is a utility. So we're injecting a lot of power into the grid. And so in terms of bankability, that utility's got to be bankable for it to commercially work. And unfortunately, we find that, across many African countries, we just haven't got our act together in terms of, can we afford to pay for the electricity? There's, of course, a lot of governance issues in some countries. And where there's just no clear policy, then it's very difficult to go in. The other challenge for us is, our unique selling point is being able to bring financing, construction, and operational capacity. So we're not really doing greenfield development. We're not going into Ghana or Sierra Leone or wherever and looking for land and starting these projects from scratch. We only have a very short window to invest and return money to investors. So we have to come in where projects are very well developed. And so we're just bringing these projects into financial close and constructing and operating them. And there's a huge, gap in terms of getting good, credible projects that are being developed locally. And that's one of the challenges in our space, is getting good counterparties on the ground who actually understand how to put these deals together, who understand what studies you need to do. So we do spend a lot of time with developers trying to create capacity, as well as with the utilities, really trying to help them understand what needs to come together for these deals to be deliverable commercially.
Well, we have reached the end of time. Before we close, I wanted to give Mahua and Sonia a chance to say a final word if they wanted. What would they like all of us to take away? A last thought, perhaps, and before I thank you all, do you have something you'd like to say? Or
I think, thank you for that, Narasimha. I think I'll just leave, we're going through a slightly unprecedented period, and especially in some of in the developing world, the business models are new, the technologies are new, and therefore a lot of things are, in that sense, unprecedented. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to simply, we have no choice. So we've got to invent and discover together. So I think I'd just leave out here that we've got to do this together. We've got to have much more involvement of the academic institutions, much more involvement of the think tanks. We've got to cross boundaries and borders a little bit more. And only then I think everybody's got to come to the same room many times over for a same particular topic. So I'll just leave that little collaboration thought here for the group. Thank you for having me.
Sonia, we started at the global scale, we'll end at the global scale.
Sure. Just one thing that I've learned in this space is, the way the system is set up right now within the UNFCCC is it's a very, very partial, limited, and fundamentally flawed system. And when you're working to try to move equity forward, you're always going to be stuck between how far you can get within the system and where you need to start putting pressure outside the system so that you can change elements of the system. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck. And so this is, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can you create linkages between those who are working inside and those who are putting very sharp pressure on the outside to try to get some movement. Otherwise, it just feels like it's very, very unmovable. So we often end up in the details of what's possible in the institutions, but we have to recognize the institutions themselves are so flawed that you also need the pressure from those willing to talk about outside institutions.
Well, I have certainly learned a lot and have a lot to think about from this panel. I thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate it.
And I echo Dr. Rao's thanks. Thank you so much for coming, and all of you for being here. I just have a few announcements. We have coffee break set up in the knob, the cafe here. And breakout sessions will start promptly at 3. The transportation breakout session will be directly across in the knob. So you'll see a screen there and some chairs set up where you saw breakfast and lunch today. So if you're going to transportation, that's where you'll be. If you're going to cultural heritage and resilience, that will be in Bowers. So we have some guides that will be leading you down. And so if you're headed to Bowers, they'll be coming around and looking for people going over there. And again, the doors are not open. So we'll have someone opening those doors. And then GO1 is where the exposures breakout with Dr. Tommy Rock will be. So you go all the way down the stairs and then loop around and go down some more as far as you can go, and many open double doors until eventually you arrive in a classroom. And again, we'll have some guides here to show you, but wanted to tell you where to arrive. Just a reminder, please remain masked while you are in the session, obviously not during coffee break if you would prefer not to. And there are bathrooms on every floor. So if there's queuing going on up here, we've got bathrooms here in the back. You can find them on the second floor and first floor as well. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at breakouts.
Thank you.